Welcome to the final episode of The Great Debate, a 10-part webinar series where two guests debate whether a cybersecurity topic should be the top priority right now. Before we jump into today's debate, a few operational items. First, today's session is being recorded, and we'll send a link to the recording shortly after the webinar wraps up. Next, there are several opportunities for today's guests to cover audience questions. You can add your question using either the chat or the question panel within GoToWebinar. You'll also notice a poll appear right now, asking you whether you're in favor or opposed to the statement. IoT security is the #1 cybersecurity priority right now. We'll tally the results and we'll ask again at the end to see if either of our guests change your mind about the topic. Finally, we'll be making a $500 donation to each of today's speakers to a charity of their choice. And with that, I'm going to share the poll results and hand it off to our moderator, Axonius CMO, Nathan Burke, to get started.
Okay, so we're at 89% opposed, 11% in favor. All right. So let's get to it. There we go. So today's topic is, should IoT security be the #1 priority right now? And our first guest taking the in favor position is Karen Jackson. Karen currently serves as president of Apogee Strategic Partners, a firm specializing in the development and implementation of technology and innovation strategies in IT, cybersecurity, autonomous systems, and smart communities. Karen served as Virginia's Secretary of Technology from 2014 to 2018, focusing on innovation, data analytics, telecommunications, cybersecurity, unmanned systems, and smart communities at the state and national level. She is active on a number of private and public sector boards, including serving as the board chair for the Virginia Unmanned Systems Association. Karen, welcome, and please tell our audience about the charity that you're supporting.
Thanks. So my charity for today, and I really want to say thank you for the generous donation, is Echo White Dogs Rescue. White German Shepherds are not very widely known, but I happen to have one. His name is Loki. And they do a great job of taking in these dogs, rehabilitating them, taking care of their medical needs. They are big dogs, and sometimes people get large dogs and don't realize what they're getting into, quite frankly. And so they do a wonderful job. I rescued mine about 7 years ago through them, and they just do a wonderful job of just the love and the care and the placement. I think I went through more screening than I would have had I adopted a child. So just kudos to them, and just want to say thank you for bringing Loki to me.
All right, excellent. Thank you for joining us today, Karen. And taking the opposing position on IoT security today is Danielle Wood, Senior Director of Partner Service Delivery at CyberReason. She is a veteran of both IT and cybersecurity, spending over 20 years in the field working primarily in security operations and digital forensics and incident response for Fortune 500 corporations, as well as federal and local law enforcement. Danielle carries multiple certifications in digital forensic examination, malware reverse engineering, and penetration testing. Her current interest in the field is open source intelligence gathering and analysis. She's authored multiple papers and has trained staff from many adjacent areas on DFIR and security. Danielle, please tell us about your charity.
Absolutely. First, again, thank you for the generous donation. The charity I've selected is the Trevor Project. Annually, about 1.8 million LGBTQ young people seriously consider suicide. The Trevor Project is there for them, providing services as well as a hotline in the event that they need support. And so I've selected the Trevor Project because it's near and dear to my heart.
All right, excellent. Thank you for joining us, Danielle. All right. Today's topic is IoT security, and to give a bit of context on the topic, I'm going to hand it off to Noah Simon, who is the Director of Product Marketing here at Axonius. So Noah, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Nate. So the Internet of Things is the network of physical objects that are embedded with sensors, software, and other technologies for the purpose of connecting and exchanging data over the internet. Examples of IoT devices commonly used by businesses today include thermostats, refrigerators, connected cameras, and more. There's also industrial IoT, which is devices or instrumentation used in industrial settings. And examples include smart power grids, logistic tracking, robotics, and others. Examples of security controls that are often applied to IoT devices include user authentication, boot and firmware verification, data encryption, and other security features embedded into chip architecture. Security controls can also be added as security software for endpoints that have computing power to run such software. Gartner predicts that spending for IoT security will nearly double in the next 4 years to over $4 billion. And most companies spend on professional services, which can include system integration and managed services that are deployed alongside existing IoT initiatives. And the second biggest area of spend is gateway security, which includes hardware or software that operates as an interchange layer between IoT devices and in internal and external networks. And finally, the last category of spend is endpoint security, which broadly refers to security controls deployed on the IoT device or embedded as a security feature. And with that overview of IoT, back to you, Nate.
All right, excellent. So on to the debate, and the format will be as follows. So each candidate will have 2 minutes to make their opening statements. After opening statements, I will read 5 submitted questions that each candidate has 2 minutes to answer. We will then give our guests 2 minutes to make their final remarks. We'll poll the audience again and then open the floor to questions from the audience. So as Anna mentioned, feel free to add your questions in the question or chat feature in GoToWebinar here, and we will get to them at the end. So this morning, I flipped this coin, and that means that Karen will go first, and I have my timer. So Karen, you have 2 minutes to make your opening statement on why IoT security should be the top priority in cybersecurity right now, and your time starts now.
Thanks. Having served as the Secretary of Technology, you become very, very aware of the number of devices that are being connected to your network without any kind of even forethought about what kind of security. You think about traffic lights, you think about, even baby monitors in a home setting, or refrigerators or crock pots, or, anything that we've got. People just turn them on and expect them to work. And we don't really give any thought whatsoever about the security of the data. Privacy is a whole different question, but just the security of the data, where it's going, who has access to it, how it's stored, all of those things are just not part of the stream of consciousness. So as we add more and more devices to the network, peripherals, the smart city slide was a great indication of just how many devices are embodied in this topic of IoT. We really have to be proactive about securing them, and really stepping in that void to make sure that where we don't have particularly savvy consumers in some cases, that we're able to provide a layer of additional security so that not only are they confident that their device is going to work, there's a level of confidence in its security as well.
All right, great. And Danielle, your time starts now.
Well, first, let me say thank you to Anna, Nathan, Noah, and the team at Axonius for this opportunity to discuss IoT security. Let me also offer my thanks to Karen Jackson for joining us in this topic. I honestly think she has the tougher argument to make. Internet of Things has been a topic of some concern over the last few years. Among the issues that periodically pop up have been the Mirai botnet, the infamous GPAC, demonstrations of attacks on cardiac monitors and the like. In reading the articles on these individual instances, it might seem like the sky will fall if the industry doesn't start addressing these issues immediately and as a matter of course. And while I'll never recommend that any connected device should be given short shrift of security, it's certainly not the #1 priority. Since the age of Stuxnet a decade ago, there hasn't been a single IoT attack that's had the scope or impact of some of the more common issues we have today. If you look at the headlines over the last week, the most important issues are nation-state attacks against microcomputer systems, not mobile devices, not IoT systems such as TVs, refrigerators, cars, whatever. Even when you look at major attacks like Stuxnet, which were targeted at IoT devices, specifically centrifuge controls in that case, the initial footholds are typically on a PC or server. Mirai was an exception, but had basic security practice been followed for the infected machines, it would have been largely a non-starter. It's really rare for the device itself to be directly attacked first unless it's wide open to the internet. Typically, the intrusions are done directly through the endpoints, and then from there, that becomes the launching point for attacks on IoT. As a security community, we can't ignore IoT, but poor endpoint security, either at the software level or the practitioner level, is the root cause of almost every major security breach in modern history, and we need to focus our efforts there. by securing the endpoint and following standard best practices, we are already enhancing the security of a vast number of IoT devices. There's no justification really for placing IoT to the forefront of the battle, at least not today. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So on to the questions. And remember, each guest will have 2 minutes to answer these 5 questions. And so on to question 1. So smart device companies often compromise on security in order to bring products to market with greater speed and cost efficiency. So should the onus fall on the device manufacturers to make IoT devices more secure by design, or are security teams failing to do the basics when it comes to securing IoT devices? And we start with you, Danielle.
Well, my answer to the question is yes, right? It's really both. Not a day goes by where we don't hear about some world-ending exploit available for some system or another, but whether it's IoT, PC, firewall, or whatever. But just as often, when exploited, we see that the exploitation of these flaws is often a function of other issues. I mean, yes, vendors need to write better code and take basic steps for securing their devices. They should enforce things like changing of the default password or stronger password policies in the devices. But practitioners in a general sense aren't doing much better. A simple search of Shodan looking for Siemens ICS compatible protocol ports found over 15,000 systems directly connected to the internet. A search of open webcams with no firewall directly attached to the internet shows over 12,000 systems. And the list goes on. And maybe those systems could be better secured by the manufacturer, but frankly, having that many systems freely available on the internet for anyone to interrogate and lob exploits at shows an extreme lack of security controls in general. And we need to really do better. One area where I hold IoT vendors responsible is not including any kind of education about the risks of not having appropriate security measures, especially when hooking something up to the internet or in their home networks. Even a simple warning statement on the box saying don't hook this directly to the internet, bad things will happen, could help prevent a lot of unnecessary compromise. But then again, maybe not. The warnings on cigarette packs in Europe are almost the whole pack. With graphic depictions of lung disease and people still smoke. But regardless, it's up to us as security practitioners to really solve this problem at the end. We can't count on the IoT vendors to do a perfect job in security. So the onus is still on us as both the end users and as the security practitioners to solve this problem.
All right, and same question to you, Karen.
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot I can add to that. I think that's, when you start to look at, and we may be flopping roles a little bit here, I think part of the consideration that we have to make, though, is when you start adding additional security to the endpoint, that's going to drive up cost. And so, we have to be aware that as this all evolves, there's got to be a balancing on either end between cost and effectiveness. And so if we spend a lot of time putting things on the end consumer device, there is the chance that it could run counter to their deployment. It could slow it down potentially. But like Danielle said, in some cases, we used to say this when I was in government, you can't overcome stupid, right? And so there are times when you just have to do things to stop people from doing bad things to themselves. And so if you can take that extra step, if the manufacturers can put in additional security that will prevent people doing things, and just like the cigarette pack warning, you can tell people 1,000,000 times and they still may or may not heed the warning. But if you take it into your own hands and you fix it before they get it, then there's less likelihood that they're going to fall into a pit once it's in their own hands. Obviously, when you start talking about consumer devices, I agree, there is less likelihood that is necessarily going to be a target unless you are someone that people want to target anyway. And so, there are different striations of, a governor would be protected, and I would say, differently than a secretary of state or a secretary of a commonwealth right now, given all the election stuff that we've seen. But given all things being equal, I do think that the manufacturers need to take this on as a challenge, because we're putting devices on state networks, we're putting devices into the hands of users that, the security teams can only do but so much, and we need to make sure that we put in as many safeguards as we can to keep people from falling into a pit, as I said before.
All right, great. So on to question 2. So traditional security tools are often not effective or can't even be deployed directly on IoT devices, which means protections need to occur at the network level. Are network controls sufficient enough to protect against IoT threats, or should security teams be investing efforts elsewhere? And we'll start here with you, Karen.
I'm gonna take a little bit of a wide swing on this one, because I think one of the places that security teams need to be investing efforts is on procurement guidelines. I think, when we start looking at, what's just happened with NIST and what's going to be going on at the federal level in terms of framework that's going to be developed around supply chain and actually even purchasing devices, I think that's a place where, beyond just the nuts and the bolts of securing a network and securing devices, I think having a policy and having basic guidelines on what you will and won't put on your network is something that could easily be done. Is it enough? No. I mean, there has to be a combination of an awareness of what is going on to your network and managing those vendors, at the IoT level to make sure that they're putting in the right protections, the right safeguards, but then also, you have to have your own home protected, and, your servers, your networks, your devices that are internal to the enterprise, all of those have to be secured. But I think if we spent more time paying attention to the way we procure devices, and we pay attention before we even connect them to a network, what we're connecting, then I think that would go a long way to minimizing and mitigating some of the issues. You look at some of the foreign vendors that have recently, Huawei and others that have been, basically set aside because of the security threats that come with them. And I think we look more at that. I'm not saying unilaterally, it needs to be a vendor by vendor and an organization by organization assessment based on risk, but we need to make sure that we are, we're spending time developing policies and procedures so there's a standardization that then the internal nuts and bolts can do a better job of taking care of what's out there.
Great, and same question to you, Danielle.
Yeah, I really, I don't disagree with really on any particular point that Karen's brought up. I will drill on a couple of things. Going back to the question a little bit, network controls are probably not sufficient. And the reason being is because if you look at network security product, it's significantly deficient in the area of IoT and IoT exploits. You can use firewalls to prevent systems from, passing across the network willy-nilly using various and sundry rules. But in the next gen space or in the IPS space, which is really what we talk about when we talk about next gen firewalls, the signature set that's associated with IoT solutions is generally pretty weak. Most of it's geared towards exploits that are aimed at PCs and servers. So that type of control has its own weaknesses. You can manage it well and do well by using custom signatures and building granular enough security control around your network with expert segmentation. But then now all of a sudden you've gone from I want to secure this device to now I have to re-engineer my network in order to support that effort. And that's a real challenge. And so it can become extremely expensive. I agree with Karen that definitely procurement's an area that you need to be looking at. The other areas, and I think she touched on this just a little bit, is things like vulnerability management, understanding what the vulnerabilities are of the devices you're putting on the network, understanding what's on your network, being able to scan the entire network either passively or actively to understand what devices are there, and making sure that you have absolute control over those machines as best you can. The other piece that we tend to ignore in the security practitioner space in a lot of cases, usually we shovel it off to compliance and say this is a compliance problem, is configuration management. It's either operations or it belongs to compliance. The reality is I've seen instances where solid configuration management can save your rear end. If you know what your devices are configured for and against what they're supposed to be configured for, and you're regularly checking those devices on a frequent basis using automation, you can make determinations as whether a device has been tampered with. So there are a lot of options here with respect to securing them, and there are a lot of areas you have to focus on. And again, I come back to also the endpoint controls, which is really, that's going to be your first avenue of entry, and we're not doing a great job there, to be honest.
Okay. So on to question 3, and this is the last time I get to say this. I say this every time. This is my favorite question that we do on every one of these episodes. So as a CISO, or if you're advising a CISO, if you were given one additional headcount and $1 million to dedicate to IoT security initiatives, where would you start? So for the in favor candidate, where would you start specifically as it relates to IoT security? And for the opposition candidate, what would you prioritize instead? And so Danielle, we'll start with you.
Yeah, as I said in my opening argument, my primary focus, if given the opportunity, is to zero in on the endpoints and the user behavior. It's not to zero in specifically on the IoT systems. By doing an effective job of protecting the entire network using the security controls we're already supposed to be enabling, we should be doing a better job against, securing the IoT devices against the threat. There's only been a handful of truly effective IoT attacks, and even fewer of those have been succeeded really in the wild. So assuming you've got the basics of firewall, antivirus, and IPS, you've got good change control, good configuration management, and these are all what I would consider table stakes. Really at that point, I'm looking at technologies like EDR or XDR, anti-ransomware capabilities, because if we look at what the real threats are right now, IoT is not my number one concern. My number one concern right now is ransomware concerns, data loss, intrusion from nation state. These are things that I care most about. That doesn't really cover the consumer space, but I'm looking at this primarily from a business perspective.
Okay, and oops, stop, reset. Karen, same question to you.
Well, if I had an extra $1 million, I'd hire Danielle to start with. I think that would be the smartest move. And then, I can't, having come from a state government background, I can't emphasize, and I think Danielle brought it up a little bit, a lot of people don't even know what's on their network. So, I mean, if I had a good person, whether that person was a hardcore CISO or just a really good auditor, I'm not sure which one, but somebody that can actually get you a really good picture of what is on your network, help establish a baseline so you can understand the anomalies. And I've been out for a little while, so I'm not going to call products particularly because I probably date myself a little bit too much. But really having somebody that understands the landscape, can help set those baselines, can help be that go-between between the techies, quite frankly, the CISO and the hardcore team, and the people that are doing the procurement, the people that are working with the users, and the people that are really inventorying the network, keeping a close pass on that, because you would be amazed at what gets added to networks when nobody knows it. And I think that's one of the biggest vulnerability spaces for IoT is you can think you have things locked down so that people can't add things to the network. You'd be surprised how much stuff ends up where you don't think it can get to. And so spending the money on that, and then I think IoT, and again, I'm going back to my state background a bit here, because when you start looking at what's being connected to networks, procurement and the way it works doesn't necessarily mimic what goes on in private sector. But when you have a manufacturing floor and then you have an IT department, the manufacturing guys don't want to ask the IT department what they can and can't buy. They need a part, they want to go get it, and they want to slap it on, fix the problem, and move on. And so, having an investment in some way to start to bring those conversations together, and it does go back to policy, and it does go back to, knowing and being able to strike a balance with non-IT and IT. There's a lot of overlap there that we're just not taking advantage of, and we're not leveraging in order to be more secure when it comes to the IoT front. And I do think it's going to be a long-term vulnerability, especially for those that aren't coming at this from an IT vantage point. They're coming from a more traditional manufacturing or water department or small rural community perspective. They just don't have the IT staff to be able to do this. So it's incumbent on the people that are providing those parts to actually be able to secure them. So I'd spend money working with vendors and spend money working with the end users and the procurement folks.
Okay, so I think that's a good segue, and there's probably some overlap here. But question 4 is a strong understanding of all your company's assets and what's on your network is obviously foundational to IoT security. And so For instance, there's a big difference between knowing whether a device on your network is a baby monitor or a thermostat or a temperature control in a nuclear power plant. So this begs the question, if you were set on prioritizing IoT security, what are the foundational steps you need to take just to get started? And we'll start with you, Karen.
I think we've touched on a lot of this already. I said just understanding and documenting what's on your network already. And then looking at those and doing a risk assessment for each one of them. If somebody hacks into my webcam for my dog, it's very different than somebody hacking into a nuclear reactor. So, I mean, you have to assess the risk to the organization, the risk of the data that's flowing across it, and then decide where, to apply it. You can't do it all at once. There's absolutely no way to just apply one broad brush across this, which is why it's so important to get IoT hooked into the endpoints, is you can't do it all at once. There's just no way to do that. So you have to prioritize what you have. You have to prioritize what the risks are. You have to prioritize looking at who has access to what. And then I would say the other piece is you have to have a mitigation plan for when something does happen. Whether it's something small or whether it's something large, you're still going to have to deal with it. And knowing how to isolate that and be able to respond to it is paramount.
Okay. Same question to you, Danielle.
Yeah, I mean, I can't argue with the points that Karen's making. I took a slightly more technical approach, I think, to the answer to the question, rather than looking at process and those areas. I was more focused on what are the things that we can do from a technical standpoint. When you look at an IoT system at its heart, it's not really that different from a PC in many respects, with the exception of its capabilities. They've got a processor, typically ARM-based or something along those lines. There's some kind of NVRAM to serve as long-term storage, maybe a smidge of memory for execution, and a network connection. And look at a PC, it's basically the same thing, just writ large. In that respect, if I were going to prioritize IoT security, I'd probably be looking, again, going back to the things that we've already talked about, which is, change in configuration control, monitoring and vulnerability management, understanding what's on asset management. Those areas are key. And then protecting the rest of the network as you should, and focusing with a focus towards the endpoints, because that's our primary entry point. If IoT is the absolute important piece that we need to deal with, if I'm stuck into that corner, I'm going to focus on those things long before I start looking at some kind of an IoT specific solution. I want something a little more generalized, and that really is also built around controlling spend as well, right? We don't have unlimited funds in cybersecurity. Lord knows we wish we did. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to make sure that the things that we're doing today will apply and scale across the other types of technologies or new technologies that we bring into the organization. The IoT frameworks that we use currently certainly can do that if we apply them correctly. So I think that's really where the focus is. If I was going to break it down, again, it's like asset control, config management, asset monitoring, vulnerability management, those key areas. And at least that gets you into the foundational space of, I know what I have, I know what its vulnerabilities are, now I can start planning for how I want to mitigate any potential security risks.
Okay, great. So on to the final question. So the title of this session is, should IoT security be the #1 priority right now? But I think you can tell from our debaters here today that the answer needs to be a little bit more nuanced than yes or no. So the final question before we hand it over for final remarks and audience questions is this: are there different kinds of organizations that should prioritize IoT security right now, and others that should focus on other things? So let me start with you, Danielle.
So there's two industries, I think, that are, one of which is currently under siege right now, which is healthcare. It's hard to say they should prioritize this, because honestly, from personal experience and working healthcare breaches, I can say that the healthcare security space is not as strong as we would like it to be. And so generalized security there is very important, but the potential risks of the IoT devices in the healthcare space are significant. When you start looking at someone who's got potential to, basically stop a respirator, or feed false data on blood pressure or respiration or heart rate or any of those things, you really have a potential for loss of life and limb. That being said, those organizations need to get their stuff in order in a general sense first. So it's tough. On the other hand, they have a ton of IoT, and it really needs to be secured. The other place I would look is the more obvious is something a little more obvious, which is the power industry. That's a significant concern. When you look back at 2013, DHS did. They had a test that they did with a generator. It was the Aurora test, and basically they destroyed a generator just by enabling and disabling its access to the grid, which is impressive to say the least. We don't really know what the potential vulnerabilities are of that type of an attack on our larger scale systems. We have no way to test that effectively. You can't take a nuclear power plant and then throw things at it and say, does it break? So we really need to be looking at these things. In addition, you've got, the vast majority of homes, at least in my state, are hooked up to wireless power meters, right? That are smart meters. And what happens when 10 million homes falls off the grid? Because our power grid is based on load. And when there's a significant change in load like that and it can't adjust, that's when you have massive blackouts like we had in 2003. So when I look at it, I would say that focusing in on those types of things is an issue. Going back to the hospitals for a second and the healthcare industry as a whole, they're in a real pickle. COVID-19 has had a significant negative impact on basically on hospital revenue. People are not doing elective surgeries, which is where a lot of the revenue comes from. And as a result, they're in a really tough situation. On the other hand, if I was looking forward beyond the space of COVID, now that we have a vaccine and we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, when we get out of this tunnel, I think that that's a place that they need to be looking.
Okay, great. And Karen, same question to you.
Yeah, and I agree completely. Healthcare is above and beyond. The need there is just astronomical, and Danielle has covered that and thoroughly. I think the power grid is another one. Financial systems, they've been aware of this for a long time. If you start to look at anything that underpins the basic functioning of everyday life, and you start to pick off those systems, the consumer devices, I do think about, only because ultimately at some point they do hook back into some of these. When you plug your phone into your wall and you're getting internet through power lines, suddenly you're hooked to somebody else's grid. And so it's that interrelationship there that, anything that hooks into a home that a consumer hooks into, you're just adding exponential vulnerability to that situation. And so I think that's the nexus between the two worlds of the utility companies, the financial companies, and then everybody else that's logging into them. States are the same way. I think that group where you have consumers that you don't control plugging into your network in some form or fashion, there's a huge nexus there that we really are going to have to conquer. And that again goes back to why I do think there's an onus to the device manufacturers, because it's not just the end consumer when they start plugging into this. It's a state level. You have a lot of rural communities that don't have IT staff. They control water systems. They control, in some cases, there are smaller electric co-ops. No disrespect to them. Some of them are have very, very talented IT staff. Most of them do. But when you start looking at government systems, you have a real variability in how sophisticated the staff is, how much staff they really have. And then you start to look at water systems, some power systems, financial systems, they generally hook back into somebody else's system. So if you think about the Target attacks where it came through a third-party vendor, all of these intersection points are a place where we really need to look. But I can't argue with healthcare, and I can't argue with the power grid, because I think those are two of the biggest vectors. We did really well with elections this time. I think we've, we at least have a handle on that. But I think going forward, that's another area that is probably going to be a bigger and bigger target, and being able to effectively prove that elections and our democracy continues to be safe and secure is something that we're going to have to look at going forward.
All right, excellent. So that concludes the main question section. So now we're going to let each guest give their 2-minute final remarks, and then we'll poll the audience one last time and open it up for questions from the audience. So let me hand it to you, Danielle, for final remarks starting now. I think we've lost your audio.
How about that?
That's better. Let me
Okay.
restart my timer. Hang on.
Sure, no problem.
And go for it.
All right. Regardless of the threats that we've talked about to various IoT systems we've talked about here, whether that's the power grid or it's medical devices, the vast majority of organizations are more concerned about things like I've got TVs on my network, or I've got smaller devices. And in those spaces, I would say that the primary defense really needs to stay against the endpoint. We just need to keep focusing on the generalized security controls that we don't do well. Workstations and servers, not just the workstations. As I've stated, IoT device compromises typically start with the user and server endpoints. It's more phishing emails and those types of activities than it is necessarily a direct attack against the device itself first. So keeping those types of devices on its internal network so that they have the benefits of the general security controls, at the very least, allows you to focus on the primary points of entry without having to expose the IoT devices as an early attack surface. But there's two things that are vital to understand. First, you really need to know what's in your environment. If you don't have control or management of that, you can't secure the environment. You really can't secure what you don't measure. And you really can't control what you don't know about. Secondly, you've got to protect the most prevalent target first, and honestly, that's the endpoint. Attackers may want your routers, they may want your IoT devices, they'll want your data, they may want to install ransomware, but to do that, they're really going to go after the endpoints. And the reason being is the endpoint is the junction between our most effective tool, which is the workstation, and our weakest link, which is the end user. And that's why it's so effective as a means to compromise an organization. So if I'm to look at this, IoT is a consideration? Yes. Is it the consideration? No. We need to continue to do well in the other spaces and fold the IoT devices into that process as an additional consideration.
All right, great. And Karen, your final 2-minute remarks start now.
Yeah, I'm just grateful to Danielle. I think we've agreed in this debate probably more than some would have. I think it's hard to walk away from your core value when you get into these situations. And so I appreciate, the conversation, and I appreciate the interchange. I think what we're talking about is really concentric rings of security. You make sure you lock your doors to your house. Then you may secure your perimeter or live in a gated community. And then you build out based on what you believe your risk profile to be, and you secure each one of those. So, to Danielle's point, this is a blended kind of solution. You can't lay all of the responsibility at the IoT vendor, because as you've heard multiple times, there's always a user in the loop somewhere. And when you have that, that's an uncontrollable, that no matter how much security you put on a device, it's never going to be the final answer. And so I think as we look at this, as we look at IoT with more and more devices come on, I think we all have to be aware of the risks. I think we have to all be cognizant. And as we add devices to the network, we do have to make sure that our central security and our traditional protocols and our traditional ways of securing stay healthy. You can't sacrifice one for the other, but we do have to give awareness and give the devil its due, if you will, to IoT devices, that over time they're going to become more and more complex. If you think about, you can do on your cell phone what you used to have to do on a hooked to a mainframe 20 years ago. The sophistication of the end user device is headed up. It's not going down. And so as they become more and more sophisticated, we're going to have to look at ratcheting up where IoT fits in that overall security protocol. So I think you've heard, what would be a great primer, I think, for anybody getting into the IoT conversation. But I think we have to really, we're all geeks. We all love our devices, and that's not going to stop. And so we're going to need help from the manufacturers to make sure those users we're able to secure those devices and keep ourselves as safe as possible.
All right.
Great. So we'll launch the final poll now. As a reminder, the first time we did it, 11% were in favor and 89% were opposed to the statement. So we'll give everyone a few seconds. And here are the results. 22% are in favor and 78 are opposed.
All right. So now we will hand it over for audience questions. And since this is the last episode, I have an audience question. I haven't done this before. So here's my question. When it comes to IoT devices versus like any other type of device, it seems like regulation is Wild West right now. I mean, there was another IoT law, I think, last week, and a lot of these are at the state level. So I guess my question is two parts. One on the like, public policy side, which is this something that we need to have federal regulation for it to be able to apply more broadly? And then on the security practitioner side, how do you even keep up with these in a way that is meaningful so you can understand how this applies to you, whether you're an IoT manufacturer or on a security team that has a significant IoT footprint?
Karen, you want that one?
I'll start out. Here we go.
Okay.
So I think there's a danger with creating a patchwork, right? So the more that you push down to the states, the more that you push down to the localities, the more patchwork it gets, the more complicated it gets, and the less likely anybody is to do anything because of paralysis. You can't keep up with all those things. We've seen that with unmanned systems legislation. States have got to get in and try to control things, and localities want to put up moratoriums. And by the time you get done, nobody can fly anywhere because nobody knows what the rules are anywhere. And so that's not uncommon to what we're talking about here. I think, the idea of the NIST framework that's being discussed around IoT is the cybersecurity framework has fared pretty well. It's customizable. I think the first version was a real heavy lift for a lot of folks. But I think more of a framework is more workable. But when states feel like they have to knee jerk and jump in and do something on their own because it's the best thing to do, and they feel like they need to do something, which is a real common way that states want to react. I think we run the risk of just completely stymieing innovation. I think we run a risk of really putting an expense and an onus on the manufacturers that just it's not tenable. And so we need to come up with, minimums that can be regularly updated. I wish I had more confidence in the federal system to be able to do those responses more quickly. But I think the idea of this patchwork type legislation and patchwork type controls, it's going to be a slippery slope. And I think it's going to put too much burden on the actual manufacturers and the actual companies to even try to keep up. It's a near impossibility.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. I mean, the real challenge here, we live in a federated world in the United States, right? So, the federal government can put baseline requirements in and levy, penalties based on noncompliance. Where the challenge comes in is that states also are free to enact their own legislation to make whatever decisions they so choose in that respect. Typically, that comes in two forms. That comes in a form of states doing what we're talking about here, which is they're putting together a patchwork set of legislation where one state's got one thing and another state has another thing. And frankly speaking, what ends up happening in those scenarios is that in the corporate world, we're not federated. It is large-scale corporations that are producing these devices, and they're going to comply with whatever's the most restrictive legislation as they see fit, based on the potential risks associated with revenue. It's that simple. When we get into the federal space, where it becomes a little more challenging, is you get into things like California, right? So we come back to things like the efficiency, car efficiency law, right? Which is the government puts in something and then California makes something more restrictive, right? And so what happens, what California does becomes the standard for the states because there's such a large market, and nobody wants to not sell in California. So it's kind of the same problem. I would say that, you know, definitely legislation needs to happen at the federal level, and it definitely needs to be communicated effectively. And I think the opportunity, education needs to happen within organizations to make sure their security practitioners are aware of what those changes are. I mean, it's really that simple. As far as the manufacturers go and the legislation that they have to comply with, it certainly makes things a lot easier if they, you know, basically have one standard that they have to work against.
Okay. Noah, do we have any audience questions?
Sure. So I think we have time for one interesting audience question that came through. How should security teams think about consumer smart devices that may pose a risk as many employees are working from home? So for example, are smart speakers a risk that security teams should be focusing on now?
I'll take this one. Karen, I'll take this one. Yeah. So I'll tell you what we do. So I mind you, I work for an EDR company, so I'm not trying to do a shameless plug here. But we're zeroed in on the endpoints themselves. So there are a couple of things you do. One is people are working from home. Make sure that they're using devices that you've provided, if possible, and that you have strong controls on those devices. They're not administrators of their own workstations. They're still hooked into the corporate networks for the basic security controls. There are limits on what they can access, that you're using effective VPN technology, those types of things. That will help. Make sure you have excellent detective controls, because all of your preventive controls are going to be for naught at some point. And so if you don't have effective detective controls, what's going to happen is systems are going to become infected eventually. At some point, your preventative controls are going to fail, and you're not going to know. And at that point, they become a launching point to attack the network. So those are kind of the key focuses. You have to start looking at the perimeter and this is something I talked about in a previous talk early on in the COVID during the COVID pandemic, and as people were moving out into becoming ostensibly road warriors from their own homes, the perimeter's gone. Your perimeter is now that endpoint. And you have to secure it as if it's its own network, basically, at that particular moment in time, which means effective defenses on the endpoint, effective detective controls on the endpoint, effective network security at the endpoint. You can't do anything else. And that's the best you can do, because you don't have any control, and you're never going to have any control over somebody's home network. That's just not going to happen.
Did you want to add anything to that, Karen? Or?
I think the point about not being able to control the home-based network is really key. You know, you find that it would be, in a perfect world, it would be wonderful if we could also control the broadband connectivity or the connectivity space that these folks operate in, the way they secure their home networks. But I think that's one place that people kind of miss the boat, is that they don't think about the lack of security on some of these home-based networks. I'm serving as an interim director at an educational institution, and they didn't even have a telework policy prior to going into COVID. So you've got a lot of last minute pull together. We have great IT staff and great employees, but it's a complete culture shift when people get into these environments. And so to expect them to understand the security side of it would be way beyond anything that's even reasonable. To the extent that you can provide connectivity that you feel is more secure than just blaring Wi-Fi all over the place, you know, that's one thing. But that piece of it, I think, is the one piece that we discount more than others, and we just say, you go home and work, use your network, we might provide a subsidy, but I think that's something that's a vulnerability point that does not get enough attention.
Okay. So Noah, do we have any more, or do we want to wrap this up?
Yep, that's all the audience questions for now.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Anna.
Great. Well, that concludes our Great Debate series. We'd like to thank both Karen and Danielle for participating today. We'll be sending a link to the recording of today's presentation. This series is sponsored by Axonius, the cybersecurity asset management company that gives customers a comprehensive asset inventory, uncovers security gaps, and automatically validates and enforces policies. To try Axonius free for 30 days or to get a demo, go to axonius.com. Finally, we're excited to be making a donation to Echo Dogs White Shepherd Rescue on behalf of Karen Jackson, and a donation to the Trevor Project on behalf of Danielle Wood. Thank you all for joining, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.